This session is our keynote session. I'm going to introduce our keynote speaker, Paul Maaנייt, and Yosef Jebbarin, who's going to be the discussant. I'm going to introduce them both, and then we're going to hear Paul, and then we're going to hear Yosef, and we are going to stick very strictly to the time. Thank you so much for being with us. We're so happy that Paul Maaנייt, who's the president of the Belgian Socialist Party, is here with us today. He has a PhD in political science, right? Both of you. Right. Okay. Okay.
It's worse.
Yeah. So Paul Maaנייt is, so we have two speakers that are both politicians and both academic and both have done so much in their life, but I want to tell you a little bit about who they are and what they've done. So Paul Maaנייt begins his political career around 2007. Then he's elected mayor of Charleroi, becomes president of the Socialist Party, and he has a lot of different political roles. But in 2019, he becomes president of the Socialist Party, and then he has several missions to try and form the federal government. And it's part of this interesting biography of his and his ideas that we're so inspired from and so waiting to hear. And our discussant of the keynote is Dr. Yosef Jebbarin, who's a senior lecturer at Tel Chai College and the University of Haifa. He's a former member of the Knesset with the Joint List, and also a former head of the Knesset Committee for the Rights of the Child. He also headed the Foreign Relations Committee of the Joint List. He's also written a lot of articles and book chapters. I particularly like his stuff on citizenship, but we can talk about that another time. To you, Paul.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for your introduction, and thank you very much to the organizers of this beautiful conference for the invitation. I'm really pleased to be here. I start my counters to be sure that I stick to my time. I'm very pleased to be here. I found this morning's discussion absolutely fascinating, and I also find that although we know all the violence that is taking place outside at less than 100 kilometers away from here, that people think that it remains important to gather here, to discuss, to keep examining different options is very encouraging. And not just encouraging, some people might think this is derisory, but I think it's not. It's not, because history and social sciences have demonstrated that ideas matter. Ideas are social facts. Ideas do shape our perception of the situation, our analysis. Ideas do predetermine our attitudes, our behavior, our strategies. They play a major role in social life. And if the wrong ideas or patterns of thought, which are very rigid, dominate the state of mind at a given moment, this can be one of the major causes of the reason why we think the situation is completely locked and we do not manage to find options. So opening options, discussing about new models, new capacities, comparing the situation here with situations in other regions of the world, in other periods in history, is, I think, not just an intellectual, very important exercise, but a very political exercise. One of my favorite quotes in politics is by a famous German Jewish philosopher, Hans Jonas, in his book, The Principle of Responsibility, who says, "The art of politics consists in maintaining the capacity of politics. If there's no politics anymore, there's only violence." And so making sure that politics remains an option is making politics in itself. And so I think we are all doing politics this morning with those kinds of discussion, and I'm very pleased to be invited to take part in this reflection. I try to say a few words about things that I know. So I'm not a specialist of the Israeli-Palestinian situation, of course. So I'll talk about Belgium, and I'll talk about the European Union and some lessons that can be drawn from these two very interesting experiences. And of course, I'll let you see if it can be interesting for your own discussion and how it can shed light on the different models that are discussed today, or open and feed this public conversation. And the reason why I think it's interesting to examine the Belgian and the European Union experiences is the fact that we have here two very different historical paths. Belgium and two very different models, but with very similar points to some extent, which I think give us opportunities to think about the present situation. Belgium is a typical case of a former unitary state which gradually evolved toward a federation of quasi-states. And the European Union is, on the contrary, a situation where different states, and mainly two states, two former enemies, France and Germany, decided to build a federation. So these are two completely different historical processes, but nevertheless, there are lots of elements that were discovered during the process that can be useful for us. Belgium was initially a unitary state, quite small one, and a very artificial state. All states are artificial, of course, but Belgium was more artificial than others. It was the creation of the superpowers of the time. The superpowers of the time wanted a neutral zone somewhere in northwest Europe to neutralize the relations and the difficult relationships between Britain, France, Germany, and the Netherlands countries, and so they decided to create a sort of second Switzerland and the north of the continent. And Belgium remained a unitary state for about 100 years. And the reason why it could remain a purely unitary state is simply the fact that there was no democracy. For 1 century, Belgium was governed by a very limited and very homogeneous elite, a French-speaking elite, which monopolized all forms of power. They monopolized economic power. They had the property of each and every means of production and land in that country, aristocracy and high bourgeoisie. They monopolized all political rights, and they monopolized the cultural rights. French was imposed everywhere on all local communities and against all local and vernacular languages and cultures. And it started to change after the First World War with the process of democratization. When universal suffrage was granted after very long strikes, after very long social movements, but when universal suffrage was granted, the national movements started to emerge in Belgium. I say the national movements in the plural because there was a Flemish national movement and a Walloon national movement, and both of them started to emerge against the national elite, and said, well, this domination of a small French-speaking bourgeois capitalist elite must cease, and we need to use nationalism, which was a very inclusive nationalism, as a means to democratize the society and to open it to the wills of the people. The case of the EU is completely different since, as I said, it's an agreement between former enemies which had fought not just the Second World War but also the First World War, also permanent tensions on the border, the War of Lorraine in the 1870s, and a very long history of confrontation between France and Germany, which had echoes everywhere on the rest of the continent. And the idea of a European federation had been discussed by philosophers and by intellectuals for more than 2 centuries. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Immanuel Kant, de Saint-Pierre and many others had talked about it at the end of the 18th century. Victor Hugo had been one of the great voices pleading for United States of Europe in the 19th century, and so on and so forth. So it means the idea was there, and it took a very, very long time. And this is, I think, the reason why ideas are so important. You have to keep the public conversation open, and you have to make sure that a feasible idea remains in the range of options so that when the window of opportunity opens, then you are there with your idea. And this is what happened at the end of the Second World War. And when I looked at the opinion polls, I understand that you can feel very despaired, but just think of this, just make this mental experience. If we had made an opinion poll in 1945 or even in 1948 or even in 1951 and asked the Germans and the French citizens whether they wanted the European integration, we would have had the same results. but there was a political elite which had the courage to say, we will go, despite the fact that the public opinion is very divided, we will start somewhere. And with this somewhere, we'll start building something which will launch along dynamics. And I think from these two experiences, the federalization of a former unitary state, Belgium, and the gradual construction of a confederal and even federal relationship between European states, we can draw three lessons which I think may be interesting for the current discussion. First, states are not what they used to be. This is a bit of a paradox, but we Europeans invented these concepts of states, of stable borders, of sovereignty in the 16th and 17th century. And then we exported this concept to the rest of the world, to Africa, to Latin America, to all the regions of the world that we colonized. And the rest of the world is now struggling with concepts that we coined and exported. But in the meantime, we Europeans have revised the meaning of those concepts. And Belgium and the European Union are good examples in this direction. In Belgium, when we gradually built this federal model, when we federalized the United States, we built subnational entities. We don't call them states, although in the Netherlands, in Dutch, they call them deelstaten, so part states. So they use the word state. We don't in French. We're much less ambitious. But what we did is building a form of federalism which has no precedent and in which those entities can be seen as quasi-states. You all remember the classic definition of what a state is. We've all learned is in the lectures of international public law or public law. A state must have a permanent population, a permanent territory, a stable territory with clear borders, a supreme government, a supreme authority, a government, and must be in a state to maintain relationships with other member states. In this definition, the quasi-state which form the Belgian Union can be seen as nearly being states. In Belgium, for example, there is no hierarchy of norms. What does it mean? It means that if there's a conflict between one of the regions, say Wallonia, and the federal government has absolutely no power to impose its vision on the region. They are on the same level, legally exactly on the same level. This means that they are forced to cooperate. The same, of course, in the relationship between the different regions, and even the Constitutional Court, which is not a real constitutional court, but that's a long other discussion, has a very limited capacity to interpret the Constitution and to impose the supremacy of the fundamental law. So this is a principle where you can say, well, yes, the constitutive entities of Belgium are nearly sovereign to some extent. To this, you can add the fact that, and this is also a peculiarity which exists in other federal systems, those regions and communities in Belgium, those entities, do have, in the external world, the competence that they have internally. It's an old principle, in foro interno, in foro externo. If you're competent for education in your own community, you're also competent for education in the international relation. What does it mean concretely? The federal government in Belgium cannot say anything about education, culture, language, and many other things. These competences pertain to the member states, if I can call this way. And so, there again, we are in a situation where these entities can be considered as nearly being states. The other direction, European integration, also led to a very deep revision of the meaning of what is a state, of what is sovereignty today. As you probably are aware of, the member states of the European Union have gradually accepted the primacy of EU law. They've accepted the fact that the Constitutional Court, call it this way, the European Court of Justice of the European Union, has a power of judicial review. They've accepted to shift competence, to abandon competence fully, competition, trade, currency to the EU. So they're not sovereign anymore in terms of trade, competition policy and industrial policy and currency, which are major competencies of any government. And they have accepted, tacitly at least, that the EU represents them on the international scene where it does have those competences. For example, if you have a broad discussion within the WTO, the World Trade Organization, on big agreements for trade at the global level, the member states are not present. It's the European Union which negotiates in name of the member states. In the climate negotiation, Officially, the member states remain sovereign or co-sovereign with the EU, but in fact, it's always the European Union which is negotiating on behalf of the member states. So the EU does have some form of international representation, and the member states have lost a lot of the elements which made their own sovereignty. This is simply to say that when I read all those analyses about should we be in favor of a multinational state or should we be in favor of a confederation of states, of course I understand the importance of those concepts and, and the symbol of those elements. But in practice, when you look at the evolution of what states means in European Union, well, this difference is simply blurred. You can't see the difference. You can't make a clear difference between a multinational state and between a confederation state. In fact, you should consider federalism as a toolbox. Federalism is a toolbox. Each and every federal country has created its own solutions on basis of its own problems and has analyzed what the other ones have done and say, well, this is an element of Canadian system that interests me, I'll take it. This is an element of another system, I take it. Here I have a problem, I can't find solutions in existing mechanisms, I will have to invent my own mechanism. It's a toolbox. And each and every federal system is sui generis by definition, and we should try and see how by, I'm not saying abandoning, but seeing that those conceptual discussions should be less important than the capacity to build ad hoc solutions to ad hoc problems. Second, federalism, second lesson that can be drawn from the EU and Belgian lesson. Federalism is not just about states, structures, polities. Federalism is also about human beings, human rights, and human communities, and always more so. The Belgian case is very interesting in this respect. Initially, when those national movements grew in 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, during the first 50 years of this national movement, we tried to find solution without going to a federal option. We tried to find solution within the framework of a unitary state. We first drew a border, what we call the linguistic border. But it was far from obvious. When you say, well, where is this border? In a number of cases it was quite easy, but in many cases it was based on the borders of the municipalities. Some municipalities were clearly French-speaking, other ones were clearly Dutch or Netherlands-speaking. But in many municipalities people spoke French and Dutch, or a mix of both. And so we had to make lots of exceptions, and to demonstrate that the border was a concept that was becoming very difficult. Second, after a while, we realized that that option, the option of trying to have two communities that would be culturally and linguistically homogeneous would simply be was simply impossible and would simply be unrealistic. In the 1960s already, there was a big clash about the question of universities, and particularly about the Université Catholique de Louvain, the Catholic University of Louvain, one of the oldest universities in Europe and in the world. This university was in Flanders, was teaching in French and Dutch, both. My parents studied there at that time, and I was born in Louvain for that reason, because my parents were students who had students-made babies at that time. And I'm one of those. But there was a strong, very strong nationalist movement in Flanders saying, well, this is not possible. We do not accept the fact that we are in Flanders. We should not have a university where French-speaking students can follow courses in French. We should not accept that. And what happened? They split the university into two pieces, and a piece, the French-speaking part of the university, was moved to what is today called Université Catholique de Louvain, Louvain-la-Neuve, a new town, a new city, a new university, so that we would have a sort of linguistic homogeneity. But that was the last example of an attempt to produce such a model. It simply didn't work. And in the 1970s, when they tried to find something else, the option was to say, we have to enrich the meaning of federalism and think that federalism is not just about regions, territorially based regions, but federalism can also be about community of human beings. The reason for this was not a very good political reason. The reason was mainly that we have three regions in Belgium, as you might know, Flanders, Wallonia, and Brussels. Brussels is landlocked into Flanders. There's no territorial continuity between Brussels and Wallonia, but Brussels was 90% French-speaking. If we had applied a principle of self-determination, Brussels would have asked to be alone as a mainly French-speaking community, and Flanders would have lost Brussels. So the Flemish said, well, no, we're not going to apply territorial principles. We're going to invent this concept of community, of human community, and to recognize that the community of human beings can be an element of a federal system, can be a component of a federal system. And so we have what we call a dual federalism. We have entities which are based on a territory, and we have entities which are based on human communities. And we, our citizens, are governed by now 3 different types of government: the linguistic government, the territorial government of the region, and the federal government, and the European Union on top of that. So we have lots of governments, which is the best way to promote the art of not being governed, because which is, after all, what we all search for. But what's interesting in this story is that the reason why they went to this was not a very good reason. It was because the Flemish didn't want to lose Brussels, though there were strategic elements of the control of the territory and of the assets. But by doing this, they created a new institution which proved very, very rich in terms of enriching the vision of what human rights means, of what cultural rights means, and of what the protection of minorities means. The good thing is, the reason why we did this is because there was no homogeneity, and because complexity forced us to invent something. There were and there still are, 75,000 people speaking German in Wallonia, 100,000 people speaking Dutch in Brussels, and more or less 100 people speaking French in Flanders. So each region does have its own linguistic minority, and we thus have a shared principle. Linguistic minorities should be protected. That's okay for everyone. But then the way we translate this into real rights and real institutions depends from one region to the other, because in some region this minority is territorially concentrated, in others it's not, and so you have to adapt to the different realities. It shows there again the malleability of federal concepts. You can do nearly everything. At least it's a very flexible concept that can be used, and those references can be interesting. Third element, citizenship. Citizenship, I think, is the key of the solution of those problems of, certainly in the history of Belgium, but to a wide extent in the history of European integration. And here, I won't dwell too much on Belgium because I only have 5 minutes left, but the EU case is very interesting. What happened in the EU? When the member state, the 6 member states of the time, negotiated the treaties of Paris and the treaties of Rome, they very rapidly agreed on the principle of free movement of goods, services and capital. On persons, there were lots of doubts. But then Italy pushed for it, because Italy had much too many workers who were disemployed and who wanted to go to Germany, France and Belgium and go working. There were already lots of bilateral agreements, and those countries had a need for manpower and for workers to work in the mines, especially in Germany, France and Belgium. And so we agreed to add the 4th principle of free movement of persons, which was initially very restricted. Free movement of persons meant actually free movement of workers. And it was associated with the principle of non-discrimination, which was very vaguely defined. What does it mean? It means if an Italian worker comes to Belgium to work in the mines, it should not be discriminated as a worker. So it should have the same social rights, it should have the same social security scheme as a national worker, initially. But what was very interesting is that this principle of free movement of person, very limited initially. You could not move because you wanted to move or to settle where you wanted to settle. You could only move as a worker with very defined condition. But this was decided in 1957. And then gradually, national citizens, using their national courts and the European courts, produced a very, very rich European jurisprudence, which gradually, step by step, eroded the boundaries of citizenship. So students got rights to go and study in other countries. And when they when they move to study, they get, on the basis of the principle of non-discrimination, the right to get social subsidies, for example, or other advantages that the national students do get. Workers too, then tourists, then providers of services, and so on and so forth. It was not decided on one time. The principle was initially very limited. Migrant workers within the EU could move and could have the same rights as the people in the country where they reside. And then gradually, a democratic dynamics, a very complex one, made of this the backbone of what has become a real European citizenship. And now with access to jobs, access to public jobs, even in many countries, to a number of them, access to security schemes, a right of settlement, which is still very conditioned, a right to access to studies, some political rights even. European citizens can vote at local elections in the country where they reside. So it's a process which started with a very little seed and which became a very dynamics of legal integration which eroded national boundaries. It's a horizontal citizenship. And this had existed in the past. It had existed in the leagues of Greek cities. It was called sympoliteia. Sympoliteia, a shared citizenship between those Greek cities. The Greeks already accepted the fact that in the same league, if you're part of the League of Athens, for example, and you move from Athens to another city of the league, you get the same rights as the citizens of the city where you go and live. This had existed in the Renaissance too. The Etruscan League of Tuscan cities in the 13th century had the same principle of horizontal citizenship. And this is a very important element of federalism. Why? Maybe the most important one. Because it is not based on structures. It's not based on polities. It's not based on states. It's based on persons, on the person's needs, on the person's everyday life. Whether you are a student, a worker, a tourist, a provider of services, on basis of your own needs, you get rights, and those rights progressively are universalized. So, and to conclude, I don't think you can transplant things that were invented in one given context to another context, of course. And this is the reason why I think federalism is a toolbox. And everybody should search in this toolbox for the tools that will be useful for you. But then, nevertheless, would like to draw three very brief and, I hope, slightly optimistic conclusions. First, what the Belgian and the European cases show is that complexity is not a problem. Complexity is a blessing. Without complexity, if we had not had minorities spread among the different components, we would never have found those agreements. Second, when you enter into a federal dynamics, you have to learn to love uncertainty, because you never know how it will evolve. You plant a seed, you make a choice of 2 or 3 principles, and then the society evolves. And the human beings live the way they live, and they use those principles, and the dynamics between the civil society, the courts, the parliaments, shapes and constantly reshapes the boundaries of this federal system. And finally, what those examples show is that domination is not a fatality. I like very much the concept of the anthropologist and psychologist, American psychologist and anthropologist Gregory Bateson, which is very useful to understand Belgium. So it's the concept of what he calls schismogenesis. There are, he says, parts of the world where, that should be my conclusion, so this will be my conclusion, where the identity of a group cannot be understood if you do not understand the original schism. You cannot understand what it is to be a French-speaking Belgium if you do not understand the constant relationship, the prejudice that we have, the conflicts that we have, but also the habits of cooperation, the sense of compromise that we've built. You cannot, the very identity of a group cannot be understood without understanding the relationship with the other group, which is a rival group, but in this rivalry, they build each other, and they build each other in this dynamics. And what Bateson shows is that this schismogenesis can be all balanced. The two groups are balanced, and they find compromises and mutual respect, or unbalanced. And when they're unbalanced, it simply means that one group dominates the other ones. But what Gregory Bateson, learning lots of schismogenesis in many different universal contexts all around the world, also shows is that there is no fatality. There are lots of schismogenesis which started with the domination of one group on the other one, and which, with the evolution of social relationships, moved to balance and mutual respect. And that's all I wish for you. Thank you very much.
يعطيكم العافية. شلوم لكلام. I was asked to speak in English, so I will do that. Not with much of excitement, but I will manage, I hope. Thank you, Yael, for coordinating this panel. And thank you, the organizers of this conference. I see Rula, Oren, Limor, and Amir. And thank you, Paul, for really this fascinating presentation, mainly about Belgium. And I guess many of you are, academics here, and they know when they are discussant, they are always grumble with the idea whether to respond to the speaker or to say what you plan to say. So I want to maybe mix between the two things, maybe with some comments about what we have heard and about also my understanding of the situation. And I must tell you that when I hear Paul and when I see what's the discussion from this morning and tomorrow, I must say that as an academic, I'm really fascinated. And I would like to get more and more ideas and thoughts. But as a politician, I feel like it's a science of fiction. Science fiction. Especially around these days. But I could clearly say also, Paul, I dare to say that from the Palestinian perspective and from the Palestinian side, we or they are ready to accept this model. We hope. You're it. You're it. You're it. But I guess that politics in our area is not heading, and politics are not heading toward that direction. And when Paul opened his presentation by speaking about the role of Europe in establishing states, I immediately thought about, definitely Europe is also to be blamed about the situation here. Not just because of the Balfour Declaration, but think about that in the time that the idea of partnership was being developed in Europe, here the idea was about more division and confrontation. And when I think about, I said that Palestinians would accept the Belgian model. When I think about what Palestinians are demanding around these days, there are the two issues that you're familiar with. Full equality, full citizenship for Palestinians in Israel, independent Palestinian state, and the issue of return, right? These are, the issue of return, of course, the right of return. These are like the main issue that discussed, when I say, of course, when I say that the independent Palestinian state, I refer to Jerusalem as the future capital or the shared capital, but I meant not to enter into details to speak about the framework. And all of you know that on the ground, things are going on the opposite side. When it comes to Palestinians in Israel, there's an increasing legislation that discriminate and exclude Palestinians. Not just, the nation-state law now, but even before that, we have, had several laws. In many issues, the time wouldn't allow me to get into details here. But the process is intensifying the exclusion of Arab citizens and basically strengthening the Jewish supremacy within Israel, without speaking about the West Bank. If we speak about the issue of return, I guess for many Jews, it's not even an issue. And I could see, as someone who lived also abroad and lived with, and I have Palestinian refugees, I could see the contradiction, how this issue is very solid and important issue for Palestinians, and it's an integral part of the Palestinian question, while for Jews it looks like it's as if it's a marginal issue. and even internal Palestinian refugees in Israel, the uprooted Palestinian citizens, like part of my family who were uprooted from Lajon, in the area of Megiddo, the Zor of Megiddo. About 34,000. I mean, I looked at the confiscation order. It included 34,000 of dunums that people in Al-Fahim used to own in Lajon. So even when it comes to citizenship rights, the issue of return is not being discussed. Now, what happened when it comes to the independent Palestinian state? And here I understand, of course, all of you follow up here. And what we have been witnessing, and maybe in the last decade or in the last 15 years, not a reality in which ball that it's difficult, as I heard this morning, to establish a Palestinian state based on 1967. What we have been witnessing on the ground is basically an implementation on the ground of a solution that has been adopted clearly by the right wing in Israel, which is basically a solution of one state. But it's not the one state based on partnership that we are hoping to discuss, but it's the apartheid Zionist state that they think of. And I don't think that I'm here reveal any secrets. Even when I used to discuss that in the Knesset with MKs like Smotrich and others, and I would tell them, I mean, do you think that there is any Palestinian who would accept the fact of living in their own besieged and controlled and supervised towns and villages in Ramallah and Nablus and Jenin without having their national right for independence? And he would tell me clearly, and it's recorded, they whether accept that, or they would be jailed, or they would be expelled. And the issue is that this solution or these ideas are being implemented not as an accident that it's going on, but as a well-organized plan on the ground. And I think one of the main issues that as a politician I have been trying to discuss with people from the international community is that today there is no partner within the Israeli side for the idea of neither a two-state solution nor a one democratic state solution. There is no partners within the Israeli decision-making powers. This gap, this is a huge gap, if the word gap is enough accurate here, between the two sides, bring me to think about the issue of the conference. Can we really discuss partnership-based ideas and solution while we are not seeing the reality on the ground? So when we were discussing France and Germany, it looks like you were describing two kind of like equal sides, two partners who are trying to reach a compromise. But this is not the situation on our end. While we are discussing is a two-state solution or a one democratic state solution, on the ground there is the implementation of the third option, which is not the academic option and it's not the theoretical option, which is the option on the real ground and on our reality of basically an apartheid state in which Palestinians will have some kind of limited autonomy in their main towns and villages, and that's about it. I guess you remember when Lieberman, that he is now in the opposition to the right wing. Think about that. Think about Lieberman's slogan when he said, and I have to mention that because I come from Al-Fahim, my town, my lovely town. When he said Al-Fahim to Palestine and Ariel to Israel, right? I mean, you remember this slogan, you know, few elections ago. And I was thinking, how come he says in Milfahim to Palestine? Because he doesn't believe that there should be Palestine, right? He still doesn't believe in that. The answer for this question explains the political situation currently in Israel, in which there is a majority of at least 70 or 75 MKs who are not seeing the possibility of establishing an independent and viable Palestinian state. So how come he speaks of Palestine? He speaks of Palestine because for him, Palestine is that kind of collection of autonomies of the main towns and villages for Palestinians. And if Ramallah and Jenin could have this kind of autonomy, so al-Fahim and Taiba and Kufr Qasim and Baka al-Gharbiya, Hanin, could also have this kind of, could also be with what's so-called Palestine. Importantly, well, your discussion about the partnership-based arrangement in Europe, but specifically in Belgium, has been important part of the discussion among Palestinians in Israel about partnership. I mean, we, both as an academic, as politicians within Israel, have really looked at Belgium, at Canada, even Northern Ireland, Switzerland, to look at this arrangement and to think about them as a paradigm for to make a transformation in Israel proper. I mean Israel 48. And think about the idea that if we as a relatively small minority, 20%, not 40%, not 45%. If we as a minority of 20% are finding great difficulties in addressing this issue vis-a-vis our Jewish partners, even those who are human rights oriented, a paradigm in which the Jewish majority would be still about 80%, 75%, think about the rejection that would come from the Jewish community if we think about the same ideas, but in all the area where Jews will not be the majority. This argument has been a major argument for me as a politician not to speak that much about the one-state solution. Because I could see how the issue of Jewish hegemony and Jewish control, especially over the army and over the main decision-making bodies, is becoming part of the Jewish consensus in our conversation. But even when we are speaking about Israel with 20% of a Palestinian minority, if this is the situation, if there is still an insistment to have or to keep or to preserve a Jewish supremacy over only 20% of Palestinians, think about how these ideas would be, treated when we present them, not just between the Jewish and Arabs within Israel, but when it comes to the entire region. As also maybe a human rights and international law advocate, and I see that my previous professor in constitutional law and international human rights, also David Kretschmer here, you see that I haven't changed the career, so I'm still Professor Kretschmer wrote the first, serious research about discrimination against the Arab citizens of Israel. And most of the issues there are still valid, unfortunately, today, over 30 years after the publication of the book. I'm saying that when I look at these issues from the international perspective and the international human rights perspective, I must say that I live more comfortable with the idea of one state. The reason is that when I think of partition based on the 1967 borders, I understand that Palestinians in this solution are left with only 22% of their historical land, of Mandate Palestine, because you know that the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza, it's only 22%. No, 22%. The area is the area suggested by maybe the deal of the century, by the Trump plan, would leave them only with 10% with the annexation. But I want to say that this 1967 borders are artificial borders. I mean, before 48, there was no such a thing called 48 borders. And the main document in international law that addressed the conflict here was the partition plan. The partition plan, I would remind you, was based on two ideas that divide the land almost 50-50, with some more land for Jews, but the idea that it's almost 50-50, but definitely not 22% for one side and 78% for the other side. Within the Jewish state, the so-called Jewish state in the decision, not the Jewish state as we understand it, this term today, within the Jewish state there was supposed to be 45% of Arab Palestinian citizens of the state, and this is something that it's missing from the discussion about the partition plan, that the partition plan said clearly that each one of the states should adopt a democratic constitution. They use this word, democratic constitution, that would guarantee the equal protection of the laws. Now, I can definitely see that the state that was called in the partition plan the Jewish state was not supposed to include any legal reference to Jewish advantage or Jewish supremacy, because it was the opposite. According to the partition plan, it was supposed to guarantee equal citizenship and full protection of the laws. And that would happen with 47% of Arab citizens. I'm saying that to say that when I look at the conflict, our conflict, from the international human rights perspective, and I see the reality today, I could see how things not just doesn't make any sense. It's basically, it's a crazy reality. It's a crazy reality. Is there a serious chance to promote a partnership-based ideas? You know, in 2000, and I would end here because Yael has started to move. I know Yael for many years, so I know how to. You know, in 2006, 2007, we initiated the what we call the future visions. تصور المستقبلي للعرب الفلسطينيين في إسرائيل, the future vision for Arab citizens. And we gave, some also discussion to this idea about, well, it's only the concept of two-state, or should we be more open to ideas of one state or partnership-based idea? The main argument against this idea of partnership-based was more practical. It was not ideological. And the argument against that was, listen, if we do that, we kind of give legitimacy to the Jewish settlements in the West Bank, because that would some kind, create a context in which they could stay. That's fine. And that might, divert the campaign and the discussion and the pressure against, the broadening of the Jewish settlements in the West Bank. So there was practical argument against not adopting that, but there also was the practical argument that I opened my discussion with it, saying that, well, if we are finding difficulty to get our equal rights within Israel as a minority that is only 20%, think about getting these rights when we are 50-50. The compromise was that we would call for binational equal arrangements within Israel, and we would argue that this binational arrangement within Israel, within 48 Israel, once they are successful, they could be a model for this arrangement in the entire area. So you could see that there was no rejection of the ideas, definitely not, because it's a clear human rights idea, and it preserves the equal protection of both people. However, we try to be more practical and we try to be more pragmatic in basically reading the political map in Israel. So we said, okay, let's have the two ideas. Let's have the idea of binational arrangements. We didn't say binational state, but we said binational equal arrangement based on collective rights, not just on individual rights, for Palestinians in Israel. Independent Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza is Jerusalem. And we said that this model of equal partnership within Israel proper would pave the way, we hope, for binational arrangement in our areas. Were we dreaming? That was, as I said, 2006, 2007. Were we dreaming? I guess most of us are here because we want this dream to be really implemented. We believe in human rights. We believe in justice. And I would end by saying to Paul, believe me that also we are still waiting for a more active and strict policy from the international community to take their rule seriously, to take international law seriously, and to take European standards on minority rights and on self-determination, to take it more seriously. And unfortunately, this is not happening, definitely not these days. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. Thank you so much, Yosef. Thank you. Great. So much to think about, huh? And you can do this over lunch. We don't have time for questions, but you're just going to have to, try and grab people going to lunch. If you would like to purchase lunch, there's a cafeteria in the next building. And I just want to tell you the next sessions. רגע, אולי נדבר עברית? סליחה. אני רוצה, אז מה שאמרתי זה ש... לא, בסדר. כן. לא, הדברים החשובים באמת. בשעה 3 בדיוק, כאן באודיטוריום, יהיה לנו פאנל של תמורות תחת כיבוש מתמשך. בבניין פולונסקי בחדר 207, מהו התפקיד של צדק מעברי, ובאולם הישיבות בוונליר, זה הקומה למעלה, פאנל על גבולות נזילים, ולא כולם בבת אחת, אבל מי שכן רוצה לרכוש ארוחת צהריים, אז יש קפיטריה בבניין ליד, וגם זו ההזדמנות לתפוס אנשים, לדבר איתם, לשאול אותם שאלות. שלום.